Page 80. The whole long history of the archipelago about which it has fallen to me to write this homegrown, homemade book has, in the course of a half-century, found in the Soviet Union almost no expression whatever in the printed word. In this, a role was played by that same unfortunate happenstance by which camp watchtowers never got into scenes in films nor in landscapes painted by our artists. But this was not true of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, nor of the Moscow-Volga Canal. There is a book about each at our own disposal, and we can write this chapter at least on the basis of documentary and responsible source material in diligently researched studies before making use of a particular source. It is considered proper to characterize it. We shall do so. Here before us lies the volume in format almost equal to the Holy Gospels, with the portrait of the demigod engraved in bas relief on the cardboard covers. The book, entitled The White Sea-Baltic Stalin Canal, was issued by the State Publishing House in 1934 and dedicated by the authors to the 17th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, and it was evidently published for Congress. It is an extension of the Gorky project of histories and factories and plants. Its editors were Maxim Gorky, I.L. Averbakh, and S.G. Fearon. This last name is little known in literary circles, and we shall explain why. Semyon Fearon, notwithstanding his youth, was deputy chief of GULag. The history of this book is as follows. On August 17, 1933, an outing of 120 riders took place aboard a steamer on the just completed canal. D.P. Vitkovsky, a prisoner who was construction superintendent on the canal, witnessed the way these people in white suits crowded on the deck during the steamer's passage through the locks, summoned prisoners from one area of the locks, where by this time they were more operational workers than construction workers, and in the presence of the canal chiefs, asked a prisoner whether he loved his canal and his work, and he did. And did he think that he managed to reform here? And did the chiefs take enough interest in the welfare of the prisoners? There were many questions, all in this general vein, and all asked from shipboard to shore, in the presence of the chiefs, and only while the steamer was passing through the locks. After this outing, 84 of these writers somehow or other managed nonetheless to worm their way out of participating in Gorky's collective work. Perhaps they wrote their own admiring verses and essays, and the remaining 36 constituted an authors' collective. By virtue of intensive work in the fall and winter of 1933, they created this unique book. This book was published last for all eternity, so that future generations would read it and be astonished. But by a fateful coincidence, most of the leaders depicted in its photographs and glorified in its texts were exposed as enemies of the people within 2 or 3 years. Naturally, all copies of the book were thereupon removed from libraries and destroyed. Private owners also destroyed it in 1937, not wishing to earn themselves a term for owning it. And that is why very few copies have remained intact to the present, and there is no hope that it may be reissued. And therefore, all the heavier is the obligation to my fellow countrymen I feel on my shoulders not to permit the principal ideas and men I feel on my shoulders I feel on my shoulders not to permit the principal ideas and men and facts described in this book to perish. It would be only just to preserve. It would be only just to preserve the names of the authors for the history of literature. Well, these at least: M. Gorky, Victor Shklovsky, Volod, Ivanov, Vera Inber, Valentin Katayev, Mikhail Zoshenko, Lapin, and Katz-Driven, Nikulin, Zelinsky, Corneli Zelinsky, Bruno Yasinski. The chapter Beat the class enemy to death. Y. Gavrilovich, Tikhonov, Alexei Tolstoy, K. Finn. Gorky explained in the following way why this book was necessary to the prisoners who had built the canal. The canal, quote, "The canal army men do not have the necessary vocabulary to express the complex feelings of reforging," unquote, and writers do have this vocabulary, so they will help. He explained as follows why the book was necessary for the writers. Quote, "Many writers, after becoming acquainted with the canal, got charged up as a result, and this has had a very positive impact on their work. A mood is going to appear in literature which will push it ahead and put it on the level of our great deeds," unquote. My italics AS, and this is the level still palpable in Soviet literature today. And why the book was necessary to its millions of readers. Many of them were soon to flow into the archipelago themselves, requires no elaboration. What was the point of view of the authors collective on the subject? First of all, certainly as to the justice of all sentences and the guilt of all those driven to work on the canal. Even the word certainty was too weak for the authors. This question is out of bounds, not only for discussion, but even for mention. It is as clear to them as the fact that the night is darker than the day. Using their vocabulary and their imagery to instill in us the misanthropic legend of the 30s, they interpret the word wrecker as the basis of the engineers being agronomists who spoke out against early sowing, maybe in snow and mud, and irrigation experts who provided Central Asia with water. All were indubitable wreckers to them. In every chapter of the book, these writers speak only with condescension of engineers as a class and as a foul, low breed. On page 125, the book accuses a significant segment of the Russian pre-revolutionary engineering profession of swindling. And this is not an individual accusation, not at all. Are we to understand that engineers were even engaged in wrecking Tsarism? And this was written by people of whom not one was capable of extracting the simplest square root, which even certain horses do in circuses. Excuse me. The authors repeat to us all the nightmare rumors of those years as historical gospel truth. The workers were poisoned with arsenic in factory dining rooms, that it is not just a piece of stupid carelessness if milk from a cow on a state farm went sour, but an enemy's stratagem to compel the country to swell up from starvation. And that's exactly how they write. In indefinite and faithless terms, they write about that sinister collective kulak who went to work in a factory and threw a bolt into the lathe. Well, after all, they are oracles of the human heart, and it is evidently easier for them to imagine this. A person has managed by some miracle to avoid exile to the tundra, has escaped to the city, and by some still greater miracle has managed to get work in a factory when he is already dying of hunger. And at this point, instead of feeding his family, he throws a bolt into the lathe. Then, on the other side, the authors cannot and do not wish to restrain their admiration for the leaders of the canal works, those employers whom they stubbornly call Chekists, although it is already the 30s, thereby forcing us to use the name too. They admired not only their minds, their wills, their organization, but also them in the highest human sense, and surprising beings. Indicative was the episode with Yakov Rappaport. See illustration 12. He does not look to be stupid. This student at Dorpa University, who failed to complete the course there, was evacuated to Voronezh, where he became deputy chairman of the provincial Cheka in his new homeland, and then deputy chief of construction at Belo Marostroy. In the words of the authors, Rappaport, while on an inspection tour of the construction site, was dissatisfied with the way the workers were pushing their wheelbarrows along, and he posed an annihilating question to the engineer in charge. Do you remember what the cosine of 45 degrees is equal to? Cos. One. And the engineer was crushed and put to shame by Rappaport's erudition, and immediately made corrections in his instructions aimed at wrecking, and the movement of the wheelbarrows immediately moved on a higher onto a high technological level. And with such anecdotes as these, the authors not only enrich their exposition artistically, but also lift us onto scientific heights. And the higher the post occupied by the employer, the greater the worship with which he is described by the authors. Unrestrained praises are lavished on the chief of GULag, Matvey Berman, number 13 in image. Much enthusiastic praise is also lavished on Lazar Kogan, illustration number 14, a former anarchist who in 1918 went over to the side of the victorious Bolsheviks and who proved his loyalty in the post of chief of the special branch of the Ninth Army, then as deputy chief of the armies in the OGPU, and was one of the organizers of GULag, and then became chief of construction of the Belomar Canal. And it is even more the case that the authors can only endorse Comrade Kogan's words, but the Iron Commissar, Comrade Yagoda is our chief, our constant leader, unquote. This is what, more than anything, doomed this book. The glorification of Genrik Yagoda was torn out, together with his portrait, from even that one copy of the book which survived for us. And we had to search a long time in order to find this portrait of him, illustration number 15. This same tone permeated the camp leaflets, and even more strongly. Here, for example, the honored guest, Comrade Kaganovich, Yagoda, and Berman, arrived at lock number 3, their portraits hung even in the barracks. People worked more quickly. Up above, they smiled, and their smile was transmitted to hundreds of people down in the excavation, and in officially inspired songs. Yagoda in person leads and teaches us, keen is his eye, and his hand is strong. Those are the verses. Their general enthusiasm for the camp way of life led the authors of the collective work to use this panegyric. No matter what corner of the Soviet Union fate should take us, even if it be the most remote wilderness of backwoods, the imprint of order and of precision and of conscientiousness marks each OGPU organization, and what OGPU organization exists in the Russian backwoods only in the camps. The camp is a torch of progress. That is the level of this historical source of ours. The editor-in-chief had something to say about this himself, addressing the last rally of Belomorskoy officials on August 25, 1933, in the city of Dmitrov. They had already moved over to the Moscow-Volga Canal project. Gorky said, "Ever since 1928, I have watched how the GPU re-educates people. And what this means is that even before his visit to Solovki, even before the boy was shot, ever since, in fact, he first returned to the Soviet Union, he had been watching them. And by then, hardly able to restrain his tears, he addressed the Czechists present, quote, 'You devils in woolen overcoats, you yourselves don't know what you have done,' unquote." And the authors note, the Czechists there merely smiled. They knew what they had done, and Gorky noted that the extraordinary modesty of the Czechists in the book itself, this dislike of theirs for publicity, was truly a touching trait. Excuse me. The collective authors do not simply seem silent about the deaths on the Belomor Canal during construction. They do not follow the cowardly recipe of half-truths. Instead, they write directly, page 190, that no one died during construction. Probably they calculated it this way. 100,000 started the canal and 100,000 finished. That meant they were all alive. They simply forgot about the prisoner transports devoured by the construction in the course of 2 fierce winters. But this is already on the level of the cosine of the cheating engineering profession. The authors see nothing more inspiring than this camp labor. They find in forced labor one of the highest forms of blazing conscientious creativity. Here is the theoretical basis of re-education. Quote, "Criminals are the result of the repulsive conditions of former times, and our country is beautiful, powerful, and generous, and it needs to be beautified. In their opinion, all those driven to work on the canal would have never found their paths." In life, if the employers had not assigned them to unite the White Sea with the Baltic. Because after all, human raw material is immeasurably more difficult to work than wood. What language, what profundity, who said that? Gorky said it in his book, disputing the verbal trumpery of humanism, and Soshenko, with profound insight, wrote, quote, "Reforging, this is not the desire to serve out one's term and to be freed, so such suspicions did exist, but in actual fact, a restructuring of the consciousness and the pride of a builder," unquote. What student of a man? Did you ever push a canal wheelbarrow on a penalty ration too? This worthy book constitutes the glory of Soviet literature and will be our guide in our judgments about the canal. How did it happen that the Belomor Canal, in particular, was selected as the first great construction project of the archipelago? Was Stalin forced to this by some kind of exacting economic or military necessity? Looking at the results of the construction, we can answer with assurance that there was none. Was he thus inspired by his spirit of noble rivalry with Peter the Great, who had dragged his fleet over portages along the same route, or with the Emperor Paul, in whose reign the first project for such a canal originated? It seemed unlikely the wise man had ever even known of this. Stalin simply needed a great construction project somewhere, which would devour many working hands and many lives. The surplus of people as a result of the liquidation of the kulaks, with the reliability of a gas execution van but more cheaply, and which would at the same time leave a great monument to his reign of the same general sort as the pyramids. In its favorite slave-owning Orient, from which Stalin derived most everything in his life, they loved to build great canals. And I can almost see him there, examining with the love the map of the north of European Russia, where the largest part of the camps were already situated at that time. And down the center of this region, the sovereign drew a line from sea to sea with the end of his pipe stem. In proclaiming this project, it had been proclaimed necessarily as urgent, because in those years, nothing which was not urgent got done in our country. If it had not been urgent, no one would have believed in its vital importance, and even the prisoners dying beneath the upturned wheelbarrows had to believe in that, in that importance, because if it had not been urgent, then they would not have been willing to die off and clear the way for a new society. One over root 2. Cosine 45. 1 over root 2. The canal must be built in a short time. It must be built cheaply. These were Comrade Stalin's instructions, and everyone who is alive then remembers what the orders of Comrade Stalin meant. 20 months. That is the time the great leader allotted his criminals both for the canal and for their own correction. From September 1931 to April 1933, he was in such a rush he would not have even give them 2 full years. 140 miles, rocky soil, an area abounding in boulders, swamps, 7 locks in the Ponevets, staircase, 12 locks in the descent to the White Sea, and this was no prostroy, which was allowed a long time for completion and allotted for an exchange. Belomorskroy was entrusted to the OGPU and received not 1 kopeck in foreign exchange. So the plan looms more and more clearly. This canal was so badly needed by Stalin and the nation that it was not to get 1 kopeck of foreign exchange. Let 100,000 prisoners work for you simultaneously. What capital is more precious? And deliver the canal in 20 months, not 1 day later. That's when you rant and rage at the wrecker engineers. The engineers say, we will make the structure of concrete. The Chechists reply, there is not enough time. The engineers say, we need large quantities of iron. The Chechists reply, replace it with wood. The engineers say, we need tractors, cranes, and construction machinery. The Chechists, there will be none of that. Not 1 kopeck of foreign exchange. Do it all by hand. The book calls this the bold Czechist formulation of a technical assignment, in other words, the Rappaport cosign. We were in such a rush that we brought in people from Tashkent for this northern project, hydrotechnologists and irrigation experts, arrested as it happened at the most opportune time. With them, a special, once again special, a favorite word, design bureau was set up on the Fursakovsky lane behind the big Lubyanka. Incidentally, the Czechist Ivanchenko asked the engineer Zhurin, why should you make a plan where there already is a plan for the Volga-Don Canal project? Use it instead. We were in such a rush that they were put to work on making the plan before the surveys had been made on the ground. Of course, we rushed survey crews into Karelia, but not one of the designers was allowed to leave within the bounds of the design office, let alone go to Karelia. This was vigilance, and therefore telegrams flew back and forth. What kind of an elevation do you have there? What kind of soil? We were in such a rush that trainloads of Czechs kept on arriving at the canal site before there were any barracks, or supplies, or tools, or a precise plan. And what was to be done? There were no barracks, but there was an early northern autumn. There were no tools, but the first month of the 20 was already passing. The first month of the 20 allotted was already passing. We were in such a rush that the engineers who finally arrived at the canal had no drafting papers, no rulers, no thumbtacks, and not even any light in their work barracks. They worked under kerosene wick lamps, and our authors rave that it was just like during the Civil War. In the jolly tone of inveterate merrymakers, they tell us, women came in silk dresses and were handed a wheelbarrow on the spot, and how many encounters there were with old acquaintances in the Tanguda, former students, Esperantists, comrades in arms from White Guard detachments. The comrades in arms from the White Guard detachments had long since encountered each other on Solovki, but we are grateful to the authors for this information that the Esperantists and the students also got their White Sea Canal wheelbarrows. Almost choking with laughter, they tell us, from the Krasnoyarsk camps in Central Asia, from Stalinabad, from Samarkand, they brought Turkmenians and Tajiks in their Bukhara robes and turbans, here to the Karelian sub-zero winter cold. Now that was something the Basmaki rebels never expected. The norm here was to break up and 2.5 cubic yards of granite and moved it the distance of 100 yards in a wheelbarrow, and the snow kept falling and covering everything up, and the wheelbarrow somersaulted off the gangways onto the snow, approximately like image number 16. This image here. But let the authors themselves speak. Quote, the wheelbarrow tottered on the wet planks and turned upside down, unquote. Quote, a human being with such a wheelbarrow was like a horse in shafts, unquote. Quote, it took an hour to load a wheelbarrow like this, unquote, and not even with granite, merely with frozen soil, or a more generalized picture, quote, the ugly depression powdered over the snow was full of people and stones, people wandering about, tripping over the stones. They bent over, 2 or 3 of them together, and taking hold of a boulder, tried to lift it. The boulder did not move. They called forth a fourth and a fifth, unquote. But at this point, the technology of our glorious century came to their aid. quote, they dragged the boulders out of the excavation with a net, the net being, unquote, the net being hauled by a cable, and the cable in turn by, quote, a drum being turned by a horse, unquote. Or here's another method that they used, wooden cranes for lifting stones. Illustration number 17, I'm showing right here. Oh my gosh. Imagine. Or here, for example, are some of the first Bielomar straw machines. Illustration number 18. Right here, the earliest machinery. That's incredible. They built all that. And these are your records? No, these are engineering geniuses. They were hurled from the 20th century into the age of the caveman, and lo, they managed to cope with the situation. The basic transportation of the Bielomorstroi consisted of Averbakh dray carts with boxes mounted on them for carrying earth, as we learned from the book, and in addition there were also Bielomor Fords, and here is what they were. Heavy wooden platforms placed on 4 wooden rollers, and 2 horses dragged this Ford along and carried stones away with it, and a wheelbarrow was handled by a team of 2 men. On slopes it was caught and pulled upward by a hookman, a worker using a hook. And how were the trees to be felled if there were neither saws nor axes? Our inventiveness could find the answer to that one too. Ropes were tied around the trees, and they were rocked back and forth by brigades pulling in different directions. They rocked the trees out. Our inventiveness can solve any problem at all. And why? Because our canal was being built on the initiative and instructions of Comrade Stalin. This was written in the newspapers and repeated on the radio every day. Just picture this battlefield with the Chechists in long, ashy gray greatcoats or leather jackets. There were only 37 of them for 100,000 prisoners. But they were loved by all, and this love caused Karelian boulders to move. Here they have paused for a moment. Illustration 19. Right here. Comrade Frankel points with his hand, and Comrade Fearon chews on his lips, and Comrade Uspensky says nothing. And is this that patricide, that same Solovki butcher? And thereby were decided the fates of thousands of people during that frosty night or the whole of that Arctic month. The very grandeur of this construction project consisted in the fact that it was carried out without contemporary technology and equipment and without any supplies from the nation as a whole. There are quote, there are not temples of noxious European American capitalism. These are socialist temples, unquote, the authors brag. In the 1960s, we will learn that this is called the Great Leap Forward. The whole book praises specifically the backwardness of the technology and the homemade workmanship. There were no cranes, so they will make their own wooden derricks, and the only metal parts the derricks had were in places where there was friction, and these parts they cast themselves, our own industry at the canal. Our authors gloat, and they themselves cast wheelbarrow wheels and their own homemade cupola furnace. Well, the country required the canal so urgently and in such haste that it could not even find any wheelbarrows for the project. It would have been too difficult an order for Leningrad factories. No, it would be unjust, most unjust, unfair to compare the most savage construction project of the 20th century, this continental canal built with wheelbarrow and pick, with the Egyptian pyramids. After all, the pyramids were built with the contemporary technology, and we used the technology of 40 years earlier. That's what our gas execution vents consisted of. We didn't have any gas for the gas chamber. Just try and be an engineer in these circumstances. All the dikes were earthen, all the floodgates were made of wood, earthen leaks now and then. And how can it be made watertight? They drive horses over the dikes with rollers. Stalin and the country were pitiless to horses as well as prisoners, because horses were a kulak animal and also destined to die. It is also very difficult to eliminate leakage at contact points between earth and wood. Wood has been used in the place of iron. Either engineer Maslov invented rhomboid wooden lock gates, and engineer Maslov did. There was no concrete used in the walls of the lock, and how could they be strengthened? They remembered an ancient Russian device called a ryashi. Cribs of logs fitted and joined, rising 50 feet high and filled with soil. Making use of the technology of the caveman, but bear responsibility according to the rules of the 20th century. If it leaks anywhere, off with your head. The Iron Commissar Yagoda wrote to Chief Engineer Krustelev, quote, on the basis of available reports, i.e. from Stulis and from Koch and Franco-Furin, you are not manifesting and you do not feel the necessary energy and interest in the work. I order you to answer immediately. Do you intend immediately? What language? To set to work in earnest and to compel that portion of the engineers which is sabotaging and interfering with the work to work conscientiously? Unquote. Now what could the chief engineer reply to that? He wanted to survive. And I admit my criminal softness. I repent of my own slackness. Oh, my goodness. Pretty incredible what they did, right? Chasing over pot. Yeah. Coast 45 is 1 over Route 2. Anyway, it's pretty impressive, what they built with wood and horses and wheelbarrows and picks. It's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, it may not have ever been a very successful canal, but those guys would be very proud of what they made in those horrible conditions. Their ingenuity and, their knowledge. It's so sad that such incredible people, any people, but, particularly to destroy all your really most brilliant and most capable, hardworking, amazing people, deliberately, to target them, to target your engineers and stuff. It's just terrible. It's evil. So evil. Anyways, thank you for listening. Have a good night.